Hi everyone, today we're going to be continuing on with our series of lectures that are going to be covering all of the different branches of government. Last time we talked about Congress, and today we're going to be moving on to talk about the presidency. Right off the bat, let's just talk about what are the qualifications and requirements for a man or a woman to become president. So there's an age requirement. You have to be 35 years or older to be the president. This is different than the Senate or the House, where the age requirements are a little bit less. The Constitution says you have to be at least 30 years to be a senator. You have to be at least 25 to be a member in the House. The presidency, you have to be at least 35. Another difference between the qualifications for Congress versus those of the president is for presidents, they have to be natural-born citizens. So at the time of their birth, they have to have been a citizen. To run in the House of Representatives or the Senate, you could have been someone who was born in a different country and was not a citizen at the time of your birth, who then emigrated to the United States to become a citizen and then eventually run for Congress. That's not allowed for the president. You have to have been born as a citizen of the United States. There's a residency requirement for the presidency. This is probably less of an important qualification just because most natural-born citizens will be people who are living in the United States for their entire life. But if you are someone in a special circumstance where you happen to be a natural-born citizen and then lived some portion of your life abroad, you have to have been living in the United States for at least 14 years in order to run for president. And finally, whereas senators and representatives in the House, as we discussed in the last lecture, are free to run for re-election however many times they want and serve for however long they want, presidents are actually term limited, so they serve 4-year terms, and they can only run for re-election one time. Alright, to get into the body of the lecture content here, we're going to be covering 4 broad topics. The first 2 are going to be dealing with presidential power. First, we're going to talk about what specific powers the president has. In the next section, we're going to continue on this topic of power and separate them into either formal powers that are outlined within the Constitution or informal powers that are sort of just assumed by virtue of the president being such a prominent figure on the national political scene. Next, we're going to get into talking about what the executive branch looks like, what its structure is. So, we have an entire branch of government called the executive branch. It's not just the president. There are numerous agencies, departments, and other bodies within the executive branch, and we'll be talking about how those operate, what they do, and what the relationship between them and the president is. And then finally, we'll shift over to talk about, given what the president's agenda is, policy-wise or implementation-wise, how does he go about achieving it? One of the things he can do is garner public support. It's also important for him to try to garner support in Congress. And we'll be talking about the various ways he can do this and what the benefits are if he is successful in garnering these various levels of support. To begin with, though, as we said, we're going to be talking about power for these first few sections. So first, let's just talk about, in broad terms, what the president's job is, and then get into some specific powers that are outlined and given to him in the Constitution of the United States. So obviously the president, as we all know, is the highest ranking official in the United States government. He heads the executive branch, and whereas last lecture most of what we were talking about was found in Article 1 of the Constitution, the presidency is described in Article 2. So let's talk now, as we do in many of these lectures, begin with talking about the Constitution and what the frame of reference was back then, what their mindset was when the founders were trying to decide what the presidency should look like. So first of all, recall back to the Articles of Confederation. We talked about those. There was no chief executive. There was no executive power in the Articles. And obviously, this led to some really big glaring deficiencies in the way the Articles government worked. There really wasn't anyone there to get things done and provide impetus for some of the policies, among other problems with the Articles. And while the need for an executive component of the government started to be realized, at the same time, the people in the new country, the United States, wanted to avoid what the situation was during the colonial period. They didn't want to go back to having a monarch who was not going to rule justly and who was not going to to pay attention to what the people wanted in terms of taxation and other sorts of policies. So there's sort of a balancing act here as we go into the Constitutional Convention and wanting some executive power, but not setting up the office to where the possibility for overreach presents itself. So one of the big issues, we talked about various debates during the Constitutional Convention. Another one of them is what sort of powers should the new presidency have? Importantly, one major decision at the convention is that the presidency and Congress should be independent from one another. I think we mentioned in previous lectures how this isn't a system that's universal throughout the world. Some countries had their chief executive chosen by and from among the legislative branch. Those at the Constitutional Convention, though, decided that they didn't want this to be the case. They wanted the two branches to be selected and composed independently of one another. And this, in theory, gives the two branches greater ability to check one another in concert with other aspects of the Constitution that provide other checks and balances. We'll talk about those here in a second and revisit the subject of checks and balances. Now, though, let's talk about some specific powers that the president has. These would be all things that are found somewhere in the Constitution and Article 2. Some powers left exclusively to the president, some are shared with Congress as part of the system of separation of powers and checks and balances. Beginning with the exclusive powers, first, the president has the ability to pardon or commute the sentences of people who are convicted of crimes by the federal government. So this is a power that governors generally have too over state convictions. The president has the power to pardon people for federal crimes. Next, the president is the commander-in-chief. This is often used as the alternative title. The president is the commander-in-chief, meaning that when there's a military conflict or a war, the ultimate tactical and strategic decisions are left up to the president to the degree that he wants to influence them. Congress, of course, has influence in when we go to war and approving conflicts that aren't officially declared wars. However, when we do go into some military campaign, it's ultimately up to the president to prosecute it in the manner that he deems appropriate. Getting into some of the executive functions of the president, implementing laws, this is maybe the core reason why we have a president. The legislative branch, as we know, passes the laws through that extensive process we discussed in the last lecture. After the law goes through Congress, so it's up to the executive branch to implement the laws. And this will be a topic that receives a lot of detailed discussion in the lecture following this regarding the bureaucracy, which is a component of the executive branch. But in the Constitution, it's outlined that the president himself, he takes care that the laws be faithfully executed. As we go through history, the way that this occurs gets more and more removed to the president into these bureaucratic departments and agencies. And so that'll be something we talk about a lot in the future. And finally, there's sort of a general vague grant of executive power to the president in the vesting clause. And so this is important, as we'll talk about later on, in that whatever the president can construe as executive power, he has the authority to do, assuming that the courts agree with his interpretation of what is executive power and what isn't executive power. So this is an area that sort of gives the president some broad power beyond what's specifically outlined, the vesting clause. We'll talk about things like executive agreements, executive orders, and it'll be more clear what we're talking about here with what executive power actually is and what does it do. Moving on to the next section, there are some specific powers outlined in Congress that the president has, but that are used in concert with Congress. So, for instance, the veto is something we talked about in the last lecture. So at the end of the lawmaking process, after usually a conference report is voted on and an identical bill is passed by both the Senate and the House, the bill has to go for the president's approval. He can choose to sign it, or he can choose to do nothing, or sometimes veto it. When he vetoes the law, we mentioned that this isn't the end of things. In rare circumstances, if there's a 2/3 majority in both the Senate and the House, they can choose to override the president's veto. So in this sense, if the president is doing something that Congress deems, to a really high level of consensus, they deem it inappropriate, Congress can check the power by overriding the veto. The treaty power is another shared power between Congress and the president. So the president is going to be the one in charge of negotiating treaties. Typically, this is going to be happening through intermediaries, representatives. The president usually won't be sitting down at the negotiating table himself, but he has usually a really high level of influence on the ultimate outcomes and what the documents look like when treaties are being negotiated. However, even though the president has exclusive authority on crafting the documents, along with whatever foreign government is being part of the treaty, the Senate has to approve these treaties before they go into effect. And this is not just a simple majority in the Senate, it's a 2/3 majority. So again, a really high threshold to where, in order for the president to get things done through the official avenue of treaties with foreign governments, there has to be a high degree of consensus within the Senate as well. We'll talk about executive agreements later on, which is a way that presidents can conduct foreign policy with other nations that bypasses the Senate as part of his broad executive power. But as far as official treaties go, there's a high degree of support needed in the Senate. And finally, another shared power between the Senate and the president is the power of executive appointment. So the president is responsible for, first of all, appointing high-level executive offices, filling those positions, so cabinet secretaries and some of the top-level advisors. Many of those will require approval by the Senate. Also, court nominees. So every federal judge in either the district court level, the appellate level, or the Supreme Court level, they're appointed by the president whenever a seat is vacated. So the president gets to select who he wants to nominate for these positions. However, he has to receive approval by the Senate. The Constitution says that the Senate doesn't, they have to give their advice, and consent is required. In this case, consent only consists of a simple majority, so the threshold here is a little bit easier than certain other actions that the president needs congressional approval for. Notably, though, this would have been a power that the Senate had a lot more influence over, a lot more leverage over, specifically the minority party in the Senate. It used to be the case that you could filibuster appointments in the Senate if you were in the minority party, and there was a particularly objectionable appointment that the president made. That was a power available to the minority party in Congress if they wanted to do so. Excuse me, the Senate specifically. The House doesn't have anything to do with appointment proceedings. But anyway, back during the 113th Congress, which is just a few years ago, back before the Democrats lost control of the Senate, they passed rules because the Republicans, they viewed them as abusing this power to filibuster appointments, and they passed rules to get rid of the filibuster for congressional appointments. This may have been something I mentioned in one of the previous lectures. This sort of had the effect of making, in cases of unified government, congressional appointments, the approval in Congress of appointments a lot easier to obtain for presidents, regardless of whether the minority party liked them or not. So in some sense, the power of Congress to check the president has been diminished a little bit by that action. Now that we've talked in a lot more detail about the powers that Congress has in the last lecture, and then our present discussion of presidential powers, maybe the content on this chart that we saw in one of the earlier lectures makes more sense. So you can recognize a lot of these different shared and some independent powers of each branch, how they basically have the effect of making any major action on the part of the federal government require some degree of cooperation between Congress and President, really limiting what each can do on their own. Continuing on, let's now talk about another really important question pertaining to the presidency, how the president is actually selected. So this is another topic that we've got to go back and reference what we've already learned about the Constitution and what's going on during the Philadelphia Convention. So during this time, we talked about how there's tension between whether or not the Congress and the executive should be separate, or the executive should be chosen from Congress. We've talked about how this is resolved in favor of separate branches for the executive and Congress. There's also tension surrounding how much input the public should have at various levels of government. The framers were, generally not in favor of having direct democracy or having too much influence from the people for fear that public opinion can sometimes be rash and lead to poor decisions. But they needed and valued some degree of input from the people to avoid the situations that were going on in the colonies where arguably oppressive laws are being imposed on the population without any input from them. So the selection of the president is in large part, again, a compromise in terms of these various factors. What's created is known as the Electoral College, which is an indirect manner of selecting the president. Each state has a set number of electoral votes. The District of Columbia is eventually given the right to vote, and they have 3 electoral votes. And to win the presidency, you have to win a majority in the Electoral College, which as it stands right now, 270 is the threshold. So again, this is important that it's an indirect election. It's not, as it's originally conceived of in the Constitution, as they're writing it and then ratifying it. It's not conceived of as something that's going to morph into what we have now, where it's resembling a direct election of the president. It was more envisioned as having some degree of buffer between those people who are selecting the president and the Electoral College and the influence of the people. So if you look back and look at how in the early presidential elections, how these electors were selected, it's left up to the states to decide. Most states actually, the electors for the Electoral College were selected in the state legislatures, so the degree of influence that the people would have had in these states is probably minimal. It's limited to the degree of influence they have on selecting the legislature itself. Only in a few states was there a direct popular vote by the people for the presidency in this early period. However, as the Electoral College evolves over time, as we know it now, every state has a popular vote for the presidency that determines the electoral vote. Most of them are winner-take-all, such that within each state, the candidate that wins the plurality of votes, they win all of the electoral votes in that state. A few of them, Nebraska and Maine, both have systems where you get a set number, a relatively low number, like I think 2 for winning the overall popular vote in the state, and then the rest of the electoral votes are determined by congressional districts. So, for example, Maine has 2 congressional districts, meaning that it has 4 total electoral votes. You get two electoral votes for winning the overall popular vote in the state, and then you can get 1 electoral vote by winning each congressional district. So if you win both congressional districts, you get both of those. If you only win 1, you get 1. So as it happened in the last election in 2016, Maine actually split its electoral vote. Trump won the 2nd district, which is the northern and more rural part of Maine, and then Hillary Clinton basically won the rest, the more populous southern district. So she got 3 and Trump got 1 from Maine. This is sort of an aside. Most of the Electoral College, the vast majority of states are just winner take all based on popular vote. So in this sense, the fact that everything is determined in large part by popular vote within the states, it gives the people maybe more of a say than was anticipated as the Constitution was being written. Obviously, it's not a straight up and down popular vote, as we've seen. The winner in the last election in the Electoral College, in fact, loses the popular vote, but there is a degree of influence of the people actually within each state in determining where the electoral votes are allocated. Alright, and as we've said numerous times, this is a theme that comes up every time we talk about the Constitution and how it was ultimately drafted. The presidency ends up being a compromise. There are people at the convention that would have wanted a less powerful executive, who fear that some of the powers that the president is given and some of the ambiguous portions maybe grow to allow the president to assume more authority than he would like. There are some at the convention who wanted a more powerful executive, on the other hand. So again, the ultimate position, what's in the document, is a compromise that maybe a lot of people didn't like. But again, the key here being that it satisfies enough people to a sufficient degree that the document is agreed upon at the convention and then originally allows for it to be ratified in the requisite number of states. Again, though, we talked about how the original draft of the Constitution is an imperfect document, and that's reflected in some of the amendments that are added after the fact. Because the presidency is it's a compromise. Maybe there are some things that people want to correct, and that's happened numerous times through the amendment process. One really glaring error, you could call it, in the original framing of the office is that the way the Electoral College originally worked in the first few elections was that there's a single vote. The Electoral College has someone who would gain a majority of the electoral votes. That person becomes a president, and the vice president, who is the second most powerful official in the executive branch, this is selected as the person who gains the second most votes in the Electoral College. So you can imagine, to give that like a more modern reference, Donald Trump wins a majority in the Electoral College, Hillary Clinton is in second. This system would have made Donald Trump the president and then Hillary Clinton the vice president. You can imagine how, when you get into situations like these, and you have the top person in the executive branch and the second most important person in the executive branch, at big odds with one another in terms of policy and ideology, this could be an issue for the operation of the branch itself. So in 1804, it only takes a few elections for people in Congress and throughout the country to realize that this is an issue, and so the 12th Amendment is passed, which changes the way the Electoral College works. Now it has two votes that are separate from one another, one for president and then a separate vote for vice president. What you see now is candidates for president, they select a running mate, and then whichever candidate for president wins, the Electoral College also elects their chosen running mate for vice president. So you have people who actually can work with one another and agree with one another in the executive branch as vice president and president. In terms of a more minor change, I guess, the 20th Amendment simply changes the date of inauguration from the 4th of March to January the 20th. So the last day of this class, January the 20th, is when inauguration happens, that Friday. So you can thank this amendment for moving it back. The 22nd Amendment, this involves presidential term limits. So as it stands now, we have an official limit as a result of the 22nd Amendment of 2 terms. So presidents can be elected for 1 term, and then they can run for re-election and serve a total of 8 years, assuming that they're not taking over midterm for someone in some strange situation like that. But this, throughout history, you can go up to the first president, George Washington, up through Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 30s, with the Great Depression, and then moving on to World War II. Every president before FDR chose voluntarily to only serve 2 terms. So this is a precedent begun by George Washington, who really a dominant political figure during the early United States of America. He had gained a lot of esteem and honor during the Revolutionary War, and as someone the nation could look up to. And one of the things that he feared is that as he goes through into the 3rd or 4th or however many terms, is that the office could start gaining too much power just by virtue of the same person being in charge and having authority for that long. So he's decided to step down after 2 terms, and he's such a swell guy that everyone likes that the people following him after that also choose to obey that precedent and only serve up for 2 terms. When we get into the 30s and FDR gets elected, there were obviously some really big upheavals in terms of what's going on in the country. You have the Great Depression, then World War II, and FDR chooses to run. He gets reelected actually 3 times, so he gets elected once, and then 3 re-election campaigns for a total of 4 times. When we get past that point in history, 1951, we decide we want to put in an official 2-term limit, and that's where the 22nd Amendment comes in. So now it's not just an informal precedent, it's actually actual statutory restriction that's in the Constitution. And finally, the 25th Amendment is an interesting case. This is an amendment that First of all, specifies how the vice president can be replaced in the event that he needs to be replaced through either like resignation or an untimely death. Another interesting aspect is that it also provides for a procedure whereby the vice president can be given power, acting power over the presidency if the president decides that he wants to voluntarily cede power. And this has been invoked in cases where the president is incapacitated. So the most recent example, it hasn't come up in President Obama's terms at all, but you go back to George W. Bush, the last president before him. Once in his first term and once in his second term, he went in for colonoscopies, which he went under anesthesia for a short amount of time. So he actually ceded power to Dick Cheney for a matter of a couple hours on each occasion. This is done through the 25th Amendment. Prior to that, there wasn't really an official avenue for either the president voluntarily ceding power to the vice president when needed, or for a case where maybe the president wasn't able to cede power voluntarily but was nonetheless incapacitated. That's also something the 25th Amendment allows for if the certain procedures whereby if the president isn't capable of ceding authority, it can be done by other officials in the government. Let's talk now a little bit about how the presidency has changed over time. If you look back and compare some early presidents in the beginning of the 19th century, for instance, and compare them with presidents in more modern eras, the more modern presidencies have generally exerted a lot more power than those closer to the founding of our country and the ratification of the Constitution. In general, the reason this is the case is that, as we pointed out earlier, Article 1, while it does have some specific powers for the president, it also has some really open-ended clauses that are open to interpretation, which have been used by the president and evolved over time to assume more power. Let's go over some of these. First of all, we've all probably heard of the State of the Union Address. This is something that's outlined in the Constitution that from time to time the president has to inform Congress about what the State of the Union is. Up until actually through the early part of the 20th century, this was typically done by the president just sending a letter to Congress. It wasn't an official address in this big formality that it is now. However, we get in the 20th century the advent of radio, television, so the president has the ability now to broadcast these big events throughout the country. So eventually the State of the Union, it morphs into a big address that the president gives. It's publicized and widely covered, and the president can use this to basically set the agenda for the legislative branch going forward for that year, and just set the tone of government as well for the year going forward. Another clause that has been used to expand the scope of the presidency is the Necessary and Expedient Clause, also found in Article 2. So this clause states that the president has the responsibility to suggest to Congress any laws or policy that he deems will be necessary and expedient, in other words, useful to the country. So while the president doesn't have a formal outlined role in Congress, he doesn't have the authority to introduce legislation or vote on legislation or anything like that. This clause gives the president some degree of justification in order to intervene in Congress and exert some influence over the process. And typically, when the president does suggest a piece of legislation, he doesn't have too hard of a time finding people in Congress to go ahead and sponsor it for him, even because the president can't do it himself. He finds people to sponsor and co-sponsor legislation to get the ball rolling. Next, the Take Care Clause. Another ambiguous one. This clause states that the president has to take care that the laws of the country are being faithfully executed. And of course, the ambiguity here involves, what does faithfully executed mean? To the extent that there's some degree of interpretation inherent in what that means, the president can basically assume whatever his meaning is and act as such. And this sort of goes hand in hand here with the broad grant of executive power to the president in the vesting clause in Article 2, which says that the president can take whatever actions can be justified as executive authority. I'm saying these things to you, these terms, that don't have immediate meaning. That's the point, is that they're open to interpretation, and the president can whatever he justifies as executive power or taking care that the laws be faithfully executed, he can use that as justification to take certain actions that he might not otherwise be able to, based on just the strict legislation that's being passed through Congress. All is, of course, subject to whether or not it's ultimately approved in the courts if it comes under question. Now, continuing with the discussion of presidential powers, one useful way to talk about them is by distinguishing between formal powers and informal powers of the presidency. So what does this terminology mean? The formal powers are those that are found in the Constitution somewhere, either expressly written down or derived by some clause in the Constitution. The informal powers are those that, on the other hand, aren't written anywhere in law or the Constitution, but just emerge as a result of the president's status as the eminent political figure in the country. So there's nobody in Washington, D.C. with his degree of visibility or clout, and this affords a certain degree of influence and power, even beyond what is officially granted to him. To begin with, let's begin talking about the formal powers. A lot of what we'll talk about as far as formal power goes will be subject matter that we've covered so far, so a lot of it will be review and reiterating. But to begin with, probably the most important formal power that the president has is his power to either approve or reject legislation. We've talked about how there are various clauses in the Constitution beyond just the veto power that give the president a say in other parts of the legislative process. In some cases, he might be referred to as a chief legislator, just because, given the veto power, given these other clauses in the Constitution that other powers emerge from, he's generally exerting a pretty strong influence at any given step of the lawmaking process for significant legislation. So we talked about the necessary and expedient clause, where he can recommend legislation to Congress. Getting more into the presidential veto, we know this is the power that allows him to reject legislation coming from Congress. Just to review, he can sign, veto, or ignore legislation. What really matters more is not so much the threat to veto, though. This is a relatively rare occurrence. What's most influential is the threat of the veto. So Congress, when they're crafting legislation, when it's being written, before it's being introduced, after it's introduced, and it's in committee, and it's in the markup process, the people in Congress, senators and representatives, have to keep in mind that if they want this legislation to go into effect, it has to satisfy the president to some degree. They can't submit something that the president doesn't like and expect it to actually go into law and mean anything unless they've got such a high degree of consensus that it doesn't matter, which is a really rare occurrence. You need 2/3 of a vote in both chambers to override a presidential veto. So although vetoes are rare themselves, the power of veto it looms over the entire process, basically, and provides the president a large degree of influence. On the subject of vetoes, they are quite rare, as I've said. George Bush, speaking of the two most recent presidents, George Bush only vetoes 11 throughout his entire tenure. This goes up to the 113th Congress for Obama, which would have been his first 4 years, I believe. Very few vetoes for him, but this is because the Democrats were in charge of either both or one chamber during this period, so there wasn't too much legislation being sent to him that needed to be vetoed, since the Democrats were in control of either both chambers or the Senate. Point being here that if you just look at this column of vetoes, or pocket vetoes even, they sort of don't indicate the overall influence that the president has on new legislation. It's not the case that George Bush only had an influence on 11 pieces of 11 laws that came out that he chose to veto. Whatever he's signing, which is the vast majority of bills that come across his desk, he's signing them because he's influenced them throughout the process of crafting them such that they are satisfactory to him. All right. Beyond legislation, we've talked about how he's the commander-in-chief. The president commands the armed forces in times of conflict. Interestingly, this power isn't really the limits of it aren't set explicitly in the Constitution like a lot of other presidential powers. Some of it is up to interpretation. Most notably, what's left to interpretation is who gets to decide when military conflicts are engaged in. So when they start, obviously the president, it's explicitly written out that he's the commander-in-chief, but it's not as clear who has the authority to start military conflicts. What is stated in the Constitution is that Congress has the authority to declare war. However, it has only actually formally declared war. It hasn't since World War II. So you think of all the other military conflicts that have occurred since then: Korea, Vietnam, two Iraq wars, a war in Afghanistan, and numerous lesser conflicts. Throughout that entire time, Congress has not declared war officially. So what this has had the effect of doing is basically shifting the power to decide when we go into a military conflict more toward the president. So if you think back to our last major war, the Iraq War starting in 2003, this was an effort predominantly driven by the president. It wasn't that there were people in Congress clamoring for war and then they eventually signed a declaration of war. It was really the executive branch making the case that we need to go to war for various reasons. In most instances, when this is occurring, for instance, back in 2003, the president does obtain approval from Congress. So not a formal declaration of war. However, both branches, both the House and the Senate, vote on whether or not they want to approve the war in Iraq, and both approve it by really large margins. So in most cases, there's not really a conflict between the president and Congress as far as when we go to war. This is in large part due to the fact that the president has so much informal influence to convince people in Congress, as we'll talk about in a second. However, one interesting piece of legislation that's emerged in recent political eras is the War Powers Resolution, where, because there's this ambiguity between who gets to decide when we go into a military conflict, specifically back in Vietnam, that conflict is heavily unpopular, and Congress doesn't believe it had an appropriate say in determining whether we go into Vietnam and the extent of deployments there and the length of the war. One thing they want to do is require explicitly that the president gain approval from Congress for basically any military campaign. So this resolution says that if the president goes and he starts using the military in whatever capacity, he has to obtain approval within 60 days of it. If he doesn't obtain approval from Congress within 60 days, the war, whatever campaign it is, becomes illegal and it has to be suspended. So this isn't really a power assumed by Congress that they've ever employed in a practical sense, and there's ambiguity as far as its constitutionality, whether or not Congress is allowed to do this, given that the president is the commander-in-chief. But just note that there is tension here as far as the war-making power of the president as compared to the war-making power of Congress. Alright, next we've talked about how there's a broad grant of executive power to the president found in the Constitution, the vesting clause. This allows the president to take whatever actions he would like if they can be justified as executive actions. What do these mean? So let's talk about two different types of executive action. So executive agreements and executive orders. These would be things that have the same force as law, so they're changing some aspect of the way policy is applied, but critically they don't require congressional approval. So if there's some ambiguity in the way a law is to be interpreted or implemented, the president can determine which way he prefers and go it that way. This can't be, these executive actions can't expressly go against existing law. They can't change law, but where there's some degree of leeway there, as far as how they're again interpreted or implemented, the president has the authority to do it whichever way he would like. Let's start out talking about executive orders, and we'll talk about agreements. The main difference here is that executive orders pertain typically to domestic policy, and executive agreements are referring to foreign policy agreements with other leaders. So executive orders These are directives usually that are telling the bureaucracy, which is a part of the executive branch that the president controls, how to implement a law in a specific way. Again, this doesn't require congressional approval. However, it can have the same force as a law or new policy. An example here is President Obama will be the president, and he has been our president for the last 8 years. He's someone who would prefer to raise the minimum wage in the country. Some have suggested 10.10 an hour. It's currently at 7.25. In 2014, when this subject matter is happening that we're talking about, this is a time when Congress is controlled, the House by the Republicans, and they eventually, later on that year, in the 2014 election, they gained the Senate as well. So basically, because you have divided government during this period, there's not really any way for Obama, regardless of his influence, to push through legislation in Congress that would raise the minimum wage. The Republicans just weren't going to do it. So one alternative way that he can affect minimum wage policy is say that, all right, I'm the chief executive. The executive branch is responsible for hiring federal contractors, which is really extensive. The federal government uses a lot of contractors to go about its business and implement laws and whatnot. So one thing you can do is say that anyone who we hire as a contractor has to implement a minimum wage of $10.10 an hour for their employees. If they refuse to do so, then they won't be receiving federal contracts, which, if you're a company that relies heavily on these contracts for your business and your revenue, obviously you're going to go and bite the bullet and pay your employees a little bit more rather than lose your contracts. So this type of order affects the wages of a lot of people throughout the country, but the president's allowed to do this by himself and doesn't need approval of Congress, which he wouldn't have been able to get to do a more broad raising of the minimum wage. Moving on to executive agreements, this is the same sort of deal where they don't require approval from Congress, but can have the really substantial effect. You recall back to what we talked about, the treaty power, how it's shared between the Senate and the president. The president, usually through intermediaries, will negotiate a treaty that he likes, if he needs to, with a foreign government. In order for this to take place, though, the Senate has to approve it with a 2/3 majority. So again, this is a high threshold, and so whenever there's some foreign priority that the president wants to take care of, and it's not feasible for him to gain that degree of support in the Senate, what he can do is an executive agreement. And this is, again, something that can't explicitly change U.S. law, but when there's some degree of ambiguity about how a law can be interpreted and how it shouldn't be, some degree of latitude for interpretation, the president can fill that in through these agreements. So a really important recent example is the Iran nuclear agreement. We don't need to get into the details of it, but suffice it to say that Republicans in the Senate didn't support it. They wanted to either get a different deal or maintain the status quo as far as Iran goes. And by this time in 2015, they had majority control in the Senate. Certainly, Obama wasn't going to get a 2/3 majority needed to ratify this sort of policy change as a treaty. So what they do is, the State Department negotiates a deal that Obama likes, and it's implemented through an executive agreement. This would be just the executive branch of the United States government making an agreement with the executive branch of the Iranian government. And a lot of what's contained in this agreement, even though it doesn't pass through Congress, it has a lot of the same effect of law. Various sanctions that were put on Iran were lifted, various assets that were frozen that belonged to Iran were unfrozen. On Iran's part, they had various criteria they had to satisfy with regards to reducing their nuclear program over time. So this is the type of thing where the Republicans in Congress wouldn't have ever approved of this. They didn't like it. However, Obama's able to sort of go aside from them and implement this desired policy move on the foreign affairs arena through an executive agreement. Again, the formal powers are the ones that are either explicitly written out in the Constitution or derived from a clause in the Constitution. Moving forward, the informal powers, this is the degree of influence the president accrues just by virtue of being the tallest figure on the political landscape, the person with the most sway in Washington, D.C. So this allows him to do things like persuade members of Congress to either vote a certain way or craft a bill in a certain manner. Sometimes the president, usually through his legal arms, can influence judicial opinions by filing briefs. Obviously, when the government of the United States is a party in a certain suit, someone appointed by the president, the Solicitor General in the Solicitor General's office, they'll be the ones handling the cases, and they'll, obviously, these people will be of like mind with the president in most cases on judicial philosophy. Persuading the public, again, this is another way the president can reach out to the public, try to get them over to the side that he agrees with, and this can provide him a lot of currency. Going back, when we're talking about members of Congress, they're constantly worried about being reelected. When we talk about this chart, to get back to it again, the lawmaking process, really the president's influence extends to most of these different parts at any given time. Really the only specific official capacity he acts in here is to either sign or veto legislation when it comes across his desk here. There's always a varying degree of informal influence going on at any of these points, though, as well. If there's someone that is considering whether they want to vote no or yes, and it's a pivotal vote, the president has various ways to influence these people. When we're talking about floor votes in the committees, the president is worried about a particular bill and what it'll look like after committee markup. This is another area where he can use his sway to talk to specific critical members in the committee and try to get the bill fast-tracked through the committee and not really be changed that much. So, really at any point in this process, the president, if he needs to, he can have some degree of influence. Another separate informal power that's worth noting, given its prevalence during the last several years, specifically the last two administrations, are signing statements. Revisiting this chart, we talked about how the president can veto a bill, he can sign a bill, he can do nothing. What the president isn't allowed to do under the Constitution, though, is approve only specific portions of the bill. So if you recall back to the federalism lecture, governors in many states have line item veto powers, whereby if they like the overall content of a bill, but there is one or two sections that they don't like, they can sign the overall bill and veto specific line items in it. In other words, getting rid of what they don't like and keeping what they do. At the federal level, though, the Constitution does not provide the president with line item veto power. He has to either sign a bill in whole or reject it in whole through a veto, and this interpretation of the Constitution has already been ruled on in the Supreme Court. Signing statements are sort of a way that President Bush and to a lesser extent President Obama have tried to get around the fact that they don't have line item power. So signing statements can be used that upon approving legislation by signing it, this would be a separate document that outlines how the executive branch is going to interpret and apply the law. Specifically, they've been used by the president to say something like, I believe this section of the law is unconstitutional, and so I'm going to choose not to enforce it. It's not usually written out that explicitly, but this is the general meaning behind a lot of these signing statements. And the tension here with the Constitution and the rulings in the Supreme Court about line item vetoes is pretty obvious. The president is supposed to sign a law in whole or veto it in whole, and signing statements have sometimes been used to get around that and in effect impose a line item power. In terms of their prevalence, it's somewhat of a recent phenomenon. Bush issued a lot of them, over 100, and during his 2 terms, this was an issue that came up pretty frequently as a criticism of him, the ambiguous legal situation of the signing statements. In 2008, when Obama was running for presidency for his first term, This was something that he brought up sometimes, that Bush shouldn't be doing this, that it's not really constitutional. However, even Obama going forward has used this tool somewhere around 30 times. And this is, as an aside, maybe a bit of an illustration of that once the executive assumes a certain power, it's difficult to rein it in and get it back to where, even when people campaign against it, once they get into office, some of the expediency that's needed in fulfilling the role as president leads them to adopt strategies and powers that maybe they had rejected previously. And let's just go ahead and conclude our discussion of presidential powers by revisiting a topic we've talked about before, checks on power. So both the Congress and the judiciary have the ability to check the president in a variety of ways. Congress, we've noted, can override presidential vetoes. That's obviously a really rare occurrence given the high threshold needed, 2/3 in each chamber of Congress. A more common way that Congress can check the president is just by not acting on whatever his legislative priorities are. So the president may have a priority in a specific policy area, may have even a specific law that he wants acted on, or a bill that he's trying to get introduced in Congress. The Congress can just say, no, we're not going to do this for you. And this is one way that they can stymie the president if Congress disagrees with what the president is doing. This has been a pretty frequent tactic. The last several years, you have a presidency controlled by a Democrat, Congress controlled by the Republicans, and so obviously there's going to be a lot of disagreement between them at various points in time, and Congress has often refused to act on legislative priorities that the president might want them to act on. In terms of the courts, we'll talk more about what they do in a lecture soon to come. However, basically anything that the president does, if they think it's unconstitutional, that comes across their desk in the form of a court case, they can rule as such and prevent the president from doing that in the future. Getting into more severe territory and back to Congress, we mentioned impeachment, I think, in the context of the last lecture, and the way that works. This is the most severe form of check that Congress can impose on the executive branch. So this is basically how they can remove either the president or other high-ranking executive officials from office through action in Congress. The standard here is supposed to be high crimes and misdemeanors. However, in practice, it's questionable whether this is actually the true standard, and it's not driven more by differences in ideology between Congress and the presidency. Importantly, this is such an extreme step and a rare one that it's never actually been successfully implemented. You've had a couple of presidents that have been impeached through the House, Johnson and Bill Clinton, but neither has been convicted in the Senate with that 2/3 majority that's needed to remove an official from office. Some background on this: Andrew Johnson, he was the vice president under Abraham Lincoln before Lincoln was assassinated, and of course, when that happens, he assumes the presidency. During the election of 1864, when Johnson is on the ticket with Abraham Lincoln, this is actually a party unity ticket to where Lincoln's a Republican, Johnson is a Democrat, and so, when the president is assassinated and the Republican is replaced with the Democrat, this is obviously creating some degree of tension between the new president and the Republicans in Congress. So Johnson, for example, is seen as maybe being too lenient on the South during the early phases of Reconstruction. So he's not really in good graces with Congress. They don't like him that much. What they actually impeach him on is a violation of an act that was passed to restrict who the president can fire. So you recall that the president has shared appointment responsibilities with the Senate. During this era, Congress had passed a law to protect certain officials from being dismissed by the president, which is later deemed unconstitutional, but Johnson violates it. Articles of impeachment are passed through the House, and then it goes on for trial in the Senate based on his violation of this appointment law. It falls only one vote short in this instance of removing him from office. So, a pretty close deal there. Clinton, on the other hand, we're probably all roughly familiar with what went on in that situation. He's impeached by the House on a couple of different charges. It goes to the Senate, and eventually it's roughly a 50-50 split between Republicans and Democrats, where most Republicans vote to convict and remove and all of the Democrats vote against it, but there aren't enough supporters of removal to reach that two-thirds threshold. One interesting case worth noting here is that of Nixon, which most of you will probably recognize as the only president to resign his seat in office. In the respect, as he resigns, as at the culmination of the Watergate scandal, there were actually articles of impeachment being drafted and getting ready to vote on in the House. So this is one case in history to where he could have maybe been the first president successfully removed through impeachment had he not resigned preemptively. There was obviously his crimes were clearer and more obvious in nature than someone like Johnson, who just fired someone, and Bill Clinton, where the primary question deals with morality. Nixon, pretty unambiguously was a part of crimes and at least misdemeanors. So this is one instance where, had he not resigned, maybe the Senate would have had enough support to actually remove a sitting president. All right. Next, we're going to move from talking about presidential powers now and get into talking about what the executive branch looks like. So, we're talking in terms of the president primarily so far. However, the executive branch deals with a lot more than just the president. There are, in fact, millions of people employed in the executive branch. We'll talk about that now in this next section. Specifically, what institutions are there. First of all, some of them are there to help the president. Others are just there to do the work of the executive branch in terms of implementing policy. And the way we're going to frame this discussion is, first of all, the president is at the center, and there are various bodies surrounding him at degrees of closeness that go out. Starting with the White House staff, we'll talk about them being the group that's closest and working in the closest proximity with the president. The executive office of the president, which is also pretty close, but not quite as much as the White House staff. And finally, the cabinet and the departments that serve under the various cabinet officials, which would be the farthest degree of separation from the president and the executive branch. To give some degree of comparison for these three different groups, the White House staff, less than 1,000 people, so a relatively small group. The executive office of the president is more than that, but still somewhat small. When you look at the cabinet departments, you're in the millions here when you're talking about the various people working in all these departments listed here. And this is just because these are really large departments that are tasked with doing the actual groundwork of the federal government, implementing law, enforcing law, providing benefits. All these tasks require employees, so this is the largest by far part of the executive branch, these departments, and this will be the primary topic when we talk about the bureaucracy. This is the primary group of units that composes the bureaucracy, the cabinet department, so that'll be a big discussion topic going forward. Starting with the cabinet, again, it's primarily composed of these people who are secretaries of these various departments. A few other people are part of the cabinet. These would be people that are selected by the president. The president gets to determine who is in the cabinet, which officials are and which aren't. The cabinet is basically just a group of the highest-ranking officials in the executive branch, and they meet from time to time with the president, and it's going to be, when there's a full cabinet meeting, it's going to be pretty broad topic matter about the policies of the federal government, what the priorities are going forward, the general state of things. And again, these are going to be people who preside over these really extensive and important departments, so they're going to have a lot to say sometimes, specifically when we're dealing with a time when there's landmark legislation being suggested that deals with any of these areas of policies. So for instance, the big healthcare Affordable Care Act passed by Obama during this period, when that's being crafted and put through Congress, he's naturally going to be working closer in closer proximity and more frequently with his Department of Health and Human Services, which was Kathleen Sebelius back then. So the cabinet's going to be, as a group, they meet every so often. That's really not as important as what's going on specifically within these departments, and also, oftentimes the one-on-one influence between the president and the secretaries that can really help him figure out what policies to press for and how they're going to be implemented. Notably, cabinet secretaries, they require approval by the Senate, but they can be hired and fired at the president's will. We talked about Andrew Johnson, how the cabinet, the Congress had originally, during that time, tried to pass laws preventing and restricting what officials in the federal government could be fired by the president. That's been since ruled unconstitutional, though, so now the president can wake up one morning and decide he doesn't like his Secretary of Defense or whoever, and dismiss them summarily and appoint someone else, subject to congressional approval. So you see some high degree of turnover. Obviously, the number depicted here on this chart of total cabinet members, that varies in large part due to whether you're a one-term president or a two-term president. So, like, Kennedy and Bush were both in office for fewer years than Clinton, Obama, or Bush too. So, the two-term presidents have more cabinet members. Specifically, when you're reelected, there's pretty heavy turnover in the transition from term 1 to term 2. During this period, it's a formality that's usually observed that everyone in every cabinet member tenders their resignation, and the president can either accept it or not accept it if he wants to. Oftentimes, the president will take these opportunities, though, to try to reform his cabinet and address whatever points of lag he sees in the executive branch. Now let's talk about the next closest circle into the president, the executive office of the president. So this is a body of organizations listed here that work next door to the White House, most of them in a less famous building called the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. And so in contrast to the cabinet departments, we talked about how the cabinet departments are responsible for implementing law, enforcing law in a lot of cases. The executive office of the presidency doesn't do any of those things. What it does is advise the president on policy. So this would be, as you recall, a smaller group of around 2,000 people. They're dealing with specific policy areas. So, for instance, if we go back to this chart, you see there's an office in the executive office of the president for Homeland Security, the Homeland Security Council. There's a corresponding cabinet department, the Homeland Security Department. The department is in charge of implementing policy, but where that policy comes from, in large part, is going to be influenced by Homeland Security Council, part of the executive office of the president. The advisory influence will be reflected in the types of laws that the president suggests to Congress, also in what types of policies the president suggests to the relevant department, to whatever policy area we're talking about. Important to note here, these are mostly political appointees. They're there because they're people whose opinion the president values. They're like-minded to the president. And most of these positions in the EOP do not require Senate approval. So these aren't people with huge amounts of responsibility in the way the government works. Again, they're mostly there in an advisory role. So the Senate doesn't really have any interest or requirement in making sure that these people are qualified. There are certain exceptions here, like the Office of Management and Budget. The director has to be confirmed by the Senate because this particular office has some really substantive responsibilities. However, most of these offices are just there to advise the president, and the people appointed to them are there because the president values their perspective and is of a like mind. Now to close, the group closest to the president on a daily basis is the White House staff. And the various staff positions, this isn't an exhaustive list, however, some of the more prominent ones here are the Chief of Staff, Press Secretary, Communications Director. We'll talk about what these specific positions mean, a little bit of detail here in a second. But just in broad terms, the White House staff, as the term implies, these are the people that are working in the White House on a daily basis. Many of the top-ranking ones will be in contact with the president on a daily basis to consult with him. And the role here, there is some degree of advising going on within the White House staff. So these are going to be typically really smart people who the president trusts on a personal basis. So naturally, there's going to be an advisory role for people that are ranking really high up on the president's staff. The primary task of this group, though, is really political in nature, though. They're there to make sure the executive branch is operating consistent with what the president wants. They're there to make sure the president's legislative goals are being reflected in Congress. They're there to make sure that the communications emanating from the White House are helping to persuade Congress, persuade the American people when needed. Basically, just there to politically help the president get what he wants done. A few specific offices that we can talk about to illustrate some of the important roles in the White House staff. The press secretary, this is a really visible person who, if you turn on C-SPAN in the middle of the day, most days there's a press briefing headed by the press secretary, and this is the person that's there really to interact with the media and to portray the White House and what's going on there in a positive way to the media that will then be covered positively and hopefully for the White House be reflected in positive sentiment in the public. The communications director is a related position. This is the person who's most involved with crafting the message that's coming out of the White House. So this is the person that determines what's going to be said, and then the press secretary is who goes out and says it. Further on down this list, we have the White House counsel, and this is the person who, whenever there's some legal ambiguity about an action being taken by the White House, by the president or someone on the White House staff, this is basically the head lawyer of the White House. So any legal ambiguity is brought to this person, and it's decided on whether this should be done, whether it's allowed under the law or not by the White House counsel. And finally, the chief of staff. This is the person in charge of everyone else in the White House staff. This is the top person in the White House besides the president, and he has a really important role in staffing these various positions, making sure everything's running the way it should. He's really going to have an important role in ensuring that the White House is operating and functioning as it should. Now, the final topic that we're going to discuss in this lecture are sort of some non-tangible factors that can help the president. Things like public support, how they do in elections, and the type of allies they have in the composition of Congress. So to get into this, talking about public approval, it's pretty intuitive to think that when a president has more people in the population who likes him, the better able he is to get done what he would like to get done. So since the 1930s, this is when the field of public opinion begins to emerge. And newspapers, TV stations, various media outlets, they begin publishing polling that says the president is doing well in the eyes of the public, or sentiment is going against the president. And obviously the president wants to be well liked in the population. He likes having approval numbers up in the 50s to 60s or higher if possible. And the reason being, at least one reason being that as his approval rises, he has a better influence on Congress. He can pressure them more effectively. He can do things like if there's a particular person who may be a swing vote on a bill that he's interested in, he can say, if you vote for this, I'll do an appearance with you, and I'm really popular, so this will help you out. Maybe he agrees to host a fundraiser for this person. As punishment, he may threaten, if you don't do what I want on this vote, I'll think about backing a challenger to you in your next re-election campaign. And of course, these carrots and these sticks can apply not just to final votes, but what's going on in committees and markup, all the way through pretty much every step in the legislative process. Speaking of approval ratings, these are highly varying based on the particular situation at a given time in a presidency. There's some patterns that we can identify, though, most notably that at the beginning of a presidential term, you tend to get what's known as the honeymoon period. So This is referring to the fact that approval ratings start out relatively high for most presidents. So after you get done with the presidential election, everyone by that point is sick of politics in large part, and most people want to unite behind the new president and say, "Yeah, you have my support." This is typically reflected in polls and higher approval ratings. As you go forward in time, though, the honeymoon ends, which it always does, and then the president starts getting judged on the merits of his performance. If people like what he's doing, they'll view him more favorably. If they dislike it, then just the opposite. And again, this is approval ratings are highly idiosyncratic as to what's going on at the time. If there's a particular hallmark piece of policy that the president has just succeeded in passing through Congress and signing, this will be a heavy influence at that time. In terms of really broad long-term influences, though, pretty much at any point in time, the economy is going to matter a lot, and oftentimes it's the most important factor, any single factor in influencing approval ratings. This chart is useless. Actually, this chart is useful in illustrating that. You see here we're charting approval ratings going back to the early '80s, spanning let's see, 5 different presidents. It doesn't cover much of Obama's term, so it's a little bit out of date in that respect. But on this first time series depicted in blue, you have the unemployment rate. Of course, higher unemployment corresponds to a weaker economy, just undesirable. On the other hand, in this red series, this is depicting presidential approval rates to where higher values correspond to disapproval. So the president wants this to be lower, along with the unemployment rate. What you see is that unemployment, it's not a perfect correspondence. However, you can identify just visually inspecting these two series that approval, or in this case disapproval, trends somewhat positively with the unemployment rate. You can note that. And also you can see for most presidents, there's a higher degree of approval. So in other words, the lower value here at the start of the Reagan administration, Bush, Clinton, second Bush, and Obama, this is indicating more approval as their term begins. Sometimes there are really short-term factors, though, that matter when we're talking about approval ratings. National crises, for example, one really obvious one. You look at this right here, the lowest point of any on this time series showing disapproval. So of course, since it's low in this particular coding scheme, this is showing a really high period of approval for George W. Bush. This is corresponding to 9/11, when in the aftermath, for the most part, people judged his response positively, and just in general, there's a big rallying effect around the country during that immediate period. So, this is one example of an event that really galvanized public approval for a president, and during that aftermath of 9/11, he was able to accomplish a lot of things, both that he wanted to, both in terms of his security policy and his domestic policy. Usually these are transient. You can go here and see as soon as this happens, really the approval doesn't last that long. It begins to erode. But just generally speaking, when there are these sort of crisis events, they can have a rallying effect on opinion. On the other hand, when you have a scandal, and this was of course one of the weaknesses, one of the reasons why you start seeing this erosion in support among Bush, is that he starts having some scandals. It's just not speaking in terms of Bush specifically, but scandals in general, when they arise, obviously they have a negative dragging effect on approval. Beyond just approval, they tend to force you to shift focus, if you're the president, from your actually substantive policy goals to dealing with the scandal. So this is hurting you in a couple of different ways. Okay, so we talked a little bit about earlier how the president has the option to talk directly to the people now. I think this came up in the context of the State of the Union, to where it eventually moves from just a simple letter to Congress to a big event where the president speaks directly to the people. And this is a broader pattern too. We just talked at length about how important approval ratings are. Nowadays we have all sorts of available means of mass communication, so the president has tended to avail himself of them in order to communicate more directly with the people more frequently, specifically in a favorable manner to get people on board with his policies. This include things like press conferences. Every so often the president will hold a press conference, interviews on TV or with magazines, planned speeches, other sorts of appearances. In more recent periods, this appears like it'll start to encompass tweets as well, and other sorts of new social media aspects by which the president can communicate directly with the people. So just in general, the president uses these venues that are available to him to try to get people on board with him. So this is an example of President Obama speaking during the policy debate around the Affordable Care Act. He holds a press conference. It makes a statement about the legislation, why it's good and why everyone should support it, and then the press asks him questions, and he answers them in the best way he can to get people over to his side. If you look at things historically, it makes sense how the pattern of going public has changed. Really, it begins with Theodore Roosevelt in particular. This would be around the time when radio was gaining more prominence. Prior to that point in time, if you wanted to talk to the public and you were the president of the United States, it would be really hard, right? Really, the only means of mass communication is newspaper reports. As radio begins to be more and more prominent, though, presidents take advantage of it and use it, use the radio addresses and then eventually television addresses in these ways that we're describing to try to gain favor. For comparison, Eisenhower, during this period, it's still relatively infrequent. It varies by president, the degree to which they try to go to the public during the early part of the 20th century. When you get into the later part of the 20th century, though, it becomes really common practice to where, Bill Clinton, for instance, is doing, on average, at least one appearance per day. That's the pattern you continue to see going forward up to the present. Another aspect of public opinion dealing specifically with election outcomes that can help the president is this notion of a mandate. And this is a really subjective term, so it's hard to pinpoint specific elections and say when a president has a mandate, and you'll find varying opinions on that. But this is basically what happens when a president has a really clear and forceful victory in an election. He can then take this and say, I have received the blessing of the people, they want what I'm selling, and you have to give it to them. I mean, he's basically channeling this sentiment to Congress, for example, to get them to come on board his legislative agenda. Maybe the media, if the president wants more favorable coverage in terms of what he has going on. So to the extent that a president can not only win victory in an election, but win it strongly, that gives him more credibility going forward once he eventually gets to the point of trying to implement policies that he wants. Speaking of Congress, again, we've talked at various points in time now how the partisan composition of Congress matters in terms of the president achieving his goals. We've talked about terminology like unified government or divided government. Unified being the case when both chambers of Congress are in control by the president's party. Divided government, of course, being the opposite, when either the House, the Senate, or both are in charge. The opposition party is in charge of them. And as you would think, when the president has like-minded people in Congress, in majorities, he has a lot easier of a time getting his agenda passed through. When it's divided government, you can have a really high degree of variance in terms of the success here. So you think back in terms of when we've had unified government in recent periods. Obama had it for a couple years after he took office from 2009 through 2011, at which point the Republicans took control of the House and eventually the Senate. So he had a lot easier time passing really large-scale pieces of legislation during that period of unified government, like the big stimulus package he passes as his first legislative priority. The Affordable Care Act is passed during this period when he has unified government. Not as much in terms of really sweeping changes through legislation after that, after the Republicans start regaining control of Congress. So, of course, you want a unified government if you're the president. It altogether makes things easier. However, having a divided government, sometimes you can still be successful to some extent in getting a legislative agenda that reflects your policy priorities. It varies a little bit, though. So, in this chart, it's displaying, of course, time on the x-axis, and then, depending on the color of the bars, whether or not Congress is unified with the president or divided. And on the y-axis, you have basically the percentage of times that the president gets what he wants in Congress. The vote goes his way. So when it's green, it's pretty universally high. In other words, in periods of united government, as we would expect, the president tends to get his way in Congress. Sometimes, when you have divided government, for instance, this is in the beginning of George Bush's term, you have a high degree of ability to compromise, and sometimes you can still get what you want in Congress if you're the president. Other times, you notice several bars here and periods where percentage of success is pretty low for the president. And also, what's not being shown on this chart is during these periods of orange as opposed to green, the divided government probably means that the bills that are being voted on aren't, by default, they probably aren't as favorable toward the president's preferences as he would like. So, illustrating back here using the early part of Bush's term, he seems to be having a large degree of success in passing legislation. However, what's in this legislation is probably a compromise and not the exact position he wants, whereas going forward, in some later years in his term, you have unified government, and the bills that are being passed during these times are probably more reflective of his legislative preferences. So, here, the beginning part, you've got to compromise with the Democrats to get what you want if you're President Bush. Later on down the line, you don't have to do so as much. All right, and to conclude, it's worth noting in terms of this discussion of what the president needs to do to get what he wants, in the realm of foreign policy, there's not too much the president does have to do just because he is basically the head guy in charge of foreign policy. We talked about treaties and how the Senate has a check there as far as ratifying treaties, but usually most of the president's foreign policy is conducted through alternative channels rather than official treaties, whether it be executive agreements, like we talked about, which bypass the Senate approval process, or rather less formal influences on foreign policy. There's not much of a check as far as the president goes. The Congress has oversight committees so that they can keep an eye out on him and potentially try to punish him in certain ways if foreign policy is deemed as inappropriate. However, when we get back to talking about like public opinion, most people are less concerned with foreign affairs rather than domestic affairs. So the president does have a pretty high degree of latitude to do what he wishes to in the realm of foreign policy just because of the way powers are arranged in the federal government and also what the audience is actually looking for the president to do. Usually they're not that concerned about what's going on in the foreign realm. Okay, so that concludes the discussion of the presidency, so I'll see you all next time.